Welcome everyone. This is Agile Jordan event, and today we're having Nevine White, who's worked in finance and accounting for all her life, basically, and she did a TW, a telecom company with more than 3,000, 4,000 employees. They did an agile transformation. They didn't even call agile at the time. That's back in 2003. Like the Agile Manifesto was written in 2001. So they removed the budgets, and she worked after that on a few consulting jobs, and now she's working on a new company, and she'll also tell you about her experience in that. I'm very excited and proud to have her talk today to us, and we'll be happy to hear from her and learn from her. So without further ado, Nevine, if you want to take it over.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the kind invitation. Hello and good evening, Agile Jordan. I'm thrilled to have been invited to speak with you tonight. It's such a new paradigm in this world that we live in now that we have the opportunity to share in this way. I don't know that even 5 years ago, the idea of crossing 10,000 kilometers of space between where I am, where you folks are, to have a conversation like this would even have been considered possible. It was all about getting to conferences and doing those kinds of things. And now we're able to do this. So this is very exciting for me. I've put together a little bit of a presentation just by way of like guiding the conversation, but I hope we can make this really interactive and have a good dialogue around this idea of how to create agility in the finance organization. So with that, let me start by introducing myself. So again, my name is Nevine White. I am currently the VP of Accounting for a telecom company called Hargray Communications Group, which is headquartered in Hilton Head, South Carolina. Most people have probably never heard of Hilton Head. It's a resort island just off the coast here, just right by the border of where the states of South Carolina and Georgia come together. And very different from where I lived for 26 years, which if you watched the talk from New York, you saw pictures of snow and mountains. This is quite the opposite. It's called the Low Country of South Carolina. Unlike the mile-high Denver, this is a meter high from the ocean. Very different climate. We traded snowstorms for tropical storms and hurricanes. The bugs here are much bigger. It's a lot more humid. But it's pretty in its own right. The sunsets are just as gorgeous. This is the bridge going over to Hilton Head Island at sunrise. It's absolutely spectacular. And the place has sort of a Jurassic feel. I always see dinosaurs coming out of the marsh at me, or maybe you could envision a Jedi being trained in this environment. It's very pretty here. Hargray, like I said, is a telecommunications company. We provide cable television service as well as high-speed data service and voice telephone lines for residential businesses and for residential customers and for businesses here in southern South Carolina, in Georgia, northern part of Florida, and the northeastern part of Alabama. So it's a fairly small footprint for a company compared to where I used to work. But this company is extremely purpose-driven. Our leadership team is very much focused on our core values. And the reason I joined this company is because they're really focused on continuous improvement, on trying to make things better. So again, my assignment here wasn't make agile finance happen. My assignment here was just make things better. And that's what I'm working on in this current job. But I'm excited to be able to share some of the experiences that we've had, and I want to specifically engage around this idea of other organizations interacting with finance, because that often works around this vehicle that we call a budget. That seems to be the primary form of communication, or at least the origin of communication between the finance organization, and I'm using the term finance as finance and accounting, and the rest of the business. And so to that end, I think we want to start here with a polling question and ask you this. So is your budget helpful? you think about your budget and the way you use it, is it helpful to you? So there's no right answer.
I have sent a poll for everyone on Zoom, and it would be really interesting if you fill it up so we can get the data and have a conversation flowing. It's interesting, Nevine, I'm the only person who has access to live data. Like everyone else gets to see after we get voting. We still have people didn't vote. 20 seconds. Ten seconds.
This is exciting.
Yeah. 5 seconds. Oh, nice. Actually, you'll be surprised by the result.
Interesting. I'm actually not surprised. This question always comes up differently for different people. Some people find budgets very helpful. I used to love doing budgets. Budgets were my jam, or as my teenagers would probably say, budgets were bars. But there are certainly ways in which the idea of having something that describes a plan in a financial context is helpful. But there are also other people who find it to be more of an obstacle because it's very rigid. It doesn't really move with the way the organization needs to move. And so depending on how it's being used, how it's being implemented, and the conversations that happen around it, some people do find it useful. There's also this idea that it's familiar. People like it because it gives them a level of comfort, something that they understand. It's been there their entire career. It creates a level of comfort. The scariest thing for human beings is uncertainty. We don't know what to do with uncertainty. So not having a budget is frightening and it's scary and it doesn't make you feel good about what's going on. So I understand why it came up this way. People are used to it. People are familiar with it. But I challenge you to think about it in a different context, especially if you're trying to implement anything in your business that has this overarching sense of agility, or whether it's a proper agile construct, or whether it's lean, for example, on an operational process, a lean methodology, whether it's process improvement through Six Sigma, all of those types of initiatives, or even if you don't have a name for it and it's just about making things better, eventually what's going to happen is that you're going to run into a wall called finance. Because when you're trying to create momentum in your business, when you're trying to create customer focus and a value chain that really drives towards being responsive and being able to react to the environment and being able to serve your customer at their pace, at their speed that they want to interact with you, usually the budget and the financial constructs will eventually get in the way of that. And the reason for that, when you think about it, is actually pretty straightforward. We make our budgets do way too many things. Our budgets are our targets, but our budgets are also our forecasts. And there's a difference between those two. When we set a target for what we want to achieve, it's really about having a goal that stretches the organization, that brings results that are greater than what we think we can actually do. Whereas when we try to forecast what's going to happen, we want that to be as realistic as possible, so we really understand what's going to happen in our business. Now, so if you have a target that's aspirational, so it's up here in terms of growth or cost savings or whatever your target is, it's up high, and your forecast says you're going along here, typically what happens in a budget process is this: the forecast suddenly magically meets the target. How that happens is on a spreadsheet. There's no actual reality to that. It just gets flexed up because we're going to meet that target no matter what. The problem comes if it's just a manipulation of numbers and you don't actually put programs in place to get that forecast to flex up to your target. Right now, you've already created a whole bunch of numbers that are not true. And that's the bulk of what happens with budgets, is people create a plan that they'd like to achieve, but one of two things about it is true. It's either completely underestimated or it's completely overestimated. And neither one of those serves the business well. The other problem with it, we typically only do this once a year because it's such a heavy effort. And when you do it only once a year, you're projecting into the future what resources you're going to need where and how they're going to get deployed. And you're going to lock that in. Well, the problem with that is very obvious right now. I guarantee you there was nobody that did a fiscal year 2020 budget that included any thought around a pandemic. And so the world can shift away from you really quickly. And if you have everything locked in, it creates a lot of chaos in the organization to try to realign, to try to figure out how to pick up those pieces and move them somewhere else. And people get very protective of those pieces. Like, you gave me 2 people or 2 resources. You gave me a capital program. You can't take it away. So it becomes a chaotic conversation. It creates a lot of stress. The other problem with budgets is you use it to measure progress and performance. But the only thing a budget really measures is how far off you are from the budget. It really doesn't speak to your results. It just speaks to how well you guessed 12 months ago, 6 months ago, whenever you created that budget. And if your guess was wrong, which it probably was because nobody can predict the future, then you're explaining every month since why the guess was wrong, instead of really focusing on how the business is going to grow or how the business can improve. And so while I understand where some people would say, yeah, my budget is helpful to me, it puts a fence out there, it also kind of puts you on autopilot, in the sense that everything gets measured by that budget as opposed to responding to the environment that you're in. And so when the rest of the organization is trying to move into new space, into new processes, when they're trying to align with customer needs, that budget can become quite the roadblock. So the question that I'd like you to think about, my slides will advance, is where is your finance team? And what I mean by that is not where they're physically located, because odds are it's in an office somewhere, or maybe in their living room right now. But the question is, where are they in terms of their processes? Are they reactive or are they proactive? So what do I mean by that? Most finance organizations are reactive. They're looking at the past. It's like they're standing on the back of a ship and they're looking at the wake where the propeller spins up the ocean behind the ship. And from that, they can tell where we were. It's like we were over there and now we're over here. And they can probably tell based on how active that wake is, how fast the ship is going. And if they look at the wake relative to the horizon or the sun or the stars, they can probably tell direction, right? But none of that helps the business understand where it's headed. It really just says where you've been. A proactive finance team, think about them. They're standing on the bridge of the ship next to the captain. And they're giving the captain useful information. How much cargo do we have? How heavy is the ship? How weighted is it? How much fuel do we have? What's the weather forecast in front of us? Where are the rocks in the ocean? That's the analogy of the proactive finance team. They're out there helping to mitigate risk and providing information that's actually useful to where the organization is headed, as opposed to just looking at the past. Now, I'm not saying the past isn't important. You can learn a lot from the past. But the past generally doesn't help operations in the moment to make a decision about the future. The next question, is your finance team more tactical or more strategic? And again, what I mean by tactical is they're doing the bookkeeping. Their nose in their spreadsheets, they're really just counting the numbers. They're not engaged with the business, really understanding the initiatives and the projects and the work that has to get done to produce more product or get closer to the customer. So are they involved in those strategic conversations and furthering those? Or are they really just about doing the day-to-day work and kind of isolated in what they're doing? Which brings us to this next bullet. Are they in the corporate office? What we like to call the ivory tower, where they're away from everybody else, they're just by themselves doing their thing? Or are they in the front line? And by front line, I mean, are they engaged in the part of the business where you're meeting the customer on a daily basis? Are they active? Are they embedded with the people who have to get the product out the door, who have to sell to the customer, who have to run the operation? It's a much better place for finance to be. And they actually, speaking for myself, a much more fun place to be. And it makes the work of finance much more meaningful if you truly understand what the business is about. Finance people very often take this position that we don't have to know what the business does. Finance is the same everywhere. But finance makes a whole lot more sense if you actually understand what your company does for a living. And once finance people figure that out, they become much better business partners. The last bullet on here is about whether or not your finance department is in a command and control mode or whether they're adaptive. Those are kind of abstract terms, so let me give you an analogy to explain that. Command and control is a little bit like a traffic light. And to be clear, I didn't come up with this great analogy. I'm stealing this from one of my colleagues, BRT Bogsness, who came up with a way to explain this to his business. But he's very active, an active speaker, so you may have actually seen him talk about this. But command and control is like that traffic light. It has very clear rules. Red means you stop, green means you go. Now, I don't know about traffic lights in Jordan. Maybe they have a yellow. Here, some of our traffic lights do not. They just go red and green. So the rules are very simple. But the rules are also based on a program that was developed by a traffic engineer somewhere in an office, probably a year ago, maybe 2. So unless you're really lucky and that traffic light you're waiting at has a sensor, odds are you're sitting there until the timer tells the traffic light to switch. So if you're sitting there and it's at night and there is no other traffic, you're still just stuck. You can't go because it's red. And I guarantee you, if you're one of those people like me, where you're sitting there going like, this is very unproductive, I should just go, that's the night it's going to be a traffic light with a camera on it, and they will take your picture and send you a ticket in the mail. That's command and control. The other example for adaptive is a traffic circle. I don't know if you call them traffic circles or roundabouts, but basically an intersection where you don't have a traffic light, where you have just a circular structure to move traffic along. That's an adaptive environment. That's where you're making the decision to go or not to go based on your immediate information that's in front of you. It wasn't pre-programmed. It says you look out your windshield. If there's traffic coming, you wait. If there's nothing coming, you go. It's highly efficient. It's more difficult to negotiate because you have to be present and you have to think about what's going on in the moment to make the decision to move or not to move. But it is a more productive construct than being forced into a rule set that says you have to stop if it's red, no matter whether there's traffic or not. So think about your finance organization. Are they more in the traffic light mode where there's rules and they just stick to them no matter what? Or are they willing to be more in a roundabout mode where they're willing to engage in the present moment and have a conversation about what's going on and move in a different direction if it's safe to do so? So again, this is a context around how finance engages with the business. We often find that there's a struggle, and I've been in this situation. So we have Mr. Joe Finance over here, and on the other side, we have, I'm going to call her Talia for lack of a better name, but she's going to be my person representing the business. It doesn't matter if it's operations or IT or technology or marketing, it's whatever is the rest of the business, right? And the conversation goes something like this. Joe is like, we need visibility and control. And everybody understands that. We need to understand what's going on in our business, but that sometimes gets in the way of being able to move faster, which is what Talia is trying to do with the business, right? We need to get moving. Our customers want product. Our customers want speed. We don't want to wait. But Joe has to record the the assets. He has to close the books. He has to get the information to do all that. Holly, on the other hand, is focused on getting products out the door. He's like, I have to be able to get my work done without having to constantly check in with you about everything I try to do. And he's back to, okay, fine, but that means you're not within policy because we have a rigid policy. We have a traffic light. Red says stop, not go. She's like, but you're being an obstacle. There's nothing coming. I can go. It's safe. And then it gets into name calling because then the conversation devolves into not being productive anymore. And I've seen this happen so many times because the finance organization is just marching to a certain rhythm that is not aligned with the rest of the business. So let's think about it in this context. What is the role of finance? Musab, do we have another poll here, or did we just want people to type this into the chat? Oh, there it is. We have another poll.
Sorry, you kind of surprised me with the with the moving. I was so into the talk. So
again,
everyone, this is another poll, and we'd like to get your feedback. What do you believe is the role of finance? You can select multiple choices, right? So it's not necessarily just one. Twenty more seconds. We want more feedback. I think people are still voting. I'll give it another 10 seconds.
Well, they're intriguing answers. So.
Yeah. Yeah. We had fun with those. Okay. 5. Let's end the polling. Here are the results.
Yeah, it's very, very good. So clearly, making sure that the business has enough cash to operate is an important part of what finance oversees. You can run you can run a business with all kinds of things, but not cash. The minute you have no cash, that means your business is done for. Keeping people out of trouble is also a good thing, especially if you're a public company. My current boss is a deal maker. He likes to buy things and sell things and, be very strategic. And I always tell him, my job is to keep you out of jail. Now, the company I work for now isn't a public company, so we have a little bit more flexibility on that, but those are all valid things. A few of you clearly run into Joe Finance about the no on your cool project, or, because that's also part of what we do. Again, if you saw my New York talk, you heard me talk about how my team was called the budget police and revenue prevention, because they saw us as getting in the way of people trying to do what probably was the right thing to do for the business, but it was outside of the fence, right? It was trying to go on a red light. And so a lot of times finance is seen as an enforcer or as, as the police force, if you will. And yeah, there are a lot of financial reports that finance and accounting have to produce for all kinds of reasons. And so if we want to go on to the next slide here.
I hope someone who said none of these would write what they thought in the chat, the role of finance. I'm really interested to see. And people who think
as long as it's nice.
Yeah, of course. As long as it's keep it professional, and others as well. And by the way, if you have any questions, put them in the chat and we'll get to them in the end as well.
Yes, absolutely. So I don't need you to read this entire list. This is more to make a point. And this is not the point that finance is more busy than you are. Everybody's busy, especially in this day and age. Everybody is super busy. There are a lot of things, however, pulling on finance's attention, and many of them are actually external to the business. Compliance and controls, especially if you're a public company, are significant. and they come with external deadlines that are not negotiable. In many cases, if you don't meet those deadlines, there are fines attached, which would mean additional costs for the business. In some cases, it's severe, and it also creates reputational risk. If you don't comply with some of these regulations, people will, you end up in the newspaper as being a company that has breached this or that law. So there's a lot of pressure there. And when Saab and I were talking about this, he made this analogy to the story of Atlas holding up the world. And this idea that Hercules comes along and says, hey, how about you go get me some of those apples? And it's like, I can't take on another thing. I'm already holding up the whole world. And so the conversation with finance has to be compelling. And the funny thing about this story, he sent me this picture of Atlas, and it was this really incredibly muscular looking Atlas. And I'm like, that's not what finance people look like. They're more like this. But the point of the conversation here is that everybody's incredibly busy. Finance is no different. There's a lot of stuff pulling on the attention. And the other part that is, finance doesn't have some of the nice constructs that enable change like other organizations do. I suspect many of you on this call are agile coaches. There are no finance coaches, right? So there are enablers in other parts of the business that help the organization think differently and move differently and enable change. A lot of those skill sets are missing on the finance side. So this is a great opportunity to start having a conversation and figuring out how you can help each other to make this better all the way around. Because a lot of times the way finance does things isn't an absolute. It's just there's never been a conversation about doing it differently. So the role of finance, to answer that question, this is how I see it, and this is based in part on some research that other organizations like CFO Magazine and the APQC have done. But for running a finance organization, this holds very true. In most companies, unless highly sophisticated systems have been implemented, finance and accounting spend probably about half their time. About 50% or so was what the last CFO survey came up with, just wrangling data. And if the term wrangling doesn't mean a lot of sense, think about cowboys trying to bring the herd together. It's really finding them and just keeping it all together. So when you spend half your time doing that, and then about another 20% of your time involved in compliance activities, there's very little time left to do cool stuff and to engage with the business in a different way. We feel like a lot of times in finance, our engagement with the business is through reporting. But truth be told, most of the business isn't waiting for our reports to come out. Because no matter what business you're in, whether finance has their reports ready or not, the business goes on. The work happens. It's the analogy I always use. It's like, a hospital. If a sick person walks in the door, it doesn't matter whether finance has their reports done or not, they're going to treat that person. And so there's no compelling reason for the rest of the business to wait for us to get our stuff done. On the right, I'm trying to represent a picture of what the ideal role of finance should be. Spending most of their time actually engaging with the business as business partners. Now, that doesn't mean the rest of this work doesn't have to get done. It just means you do it differently. You do more in this context of having automation that helps streamline the busy work, that data wrangling work, and finding ways, if you can't streamline it, to see if you really truly need it. So many finance processes are just based in tradition, and they're not necessarily required. We just tell ourselves a story that they're required. It's a secret rule that companies need budgets. There are very few organizations anywhere in the world that actually are required to have a budget. There are some, and usually it's because there's some legislation that says, as a public institution, you must deliver a budget. But I will suggest to you that you can deliver a budget with much less effort than what most organizations do today if you're one of those groups that has to do it. But for the rest of the world, having to have a budget is a management requirement. It's internal. There's nobody outside saying you have to. We're just so used to it, we can't envision what the world would be like without it. Reporting is another one of those things. most of the business doesn't care about finance reports because they don't understand them. They're teeny tiny spreadsheets in 4-point font that they can't read without their glasses and don't understand the terminology because we've never bothered to explain it to anybody. And so if we could just take all our reporting and make it, for lack of a better word, cool, so that people could actually understand what's going on and see in the numbers the story behind the business, then now we can have a conversation that's actually meaningful. And it again overlaps with this whole idea of being a good business partner and knowing the business, understanding what drives the business, being closer to helping people that engage with the customer make sound business decisions and understanding the consequences of those decisions and how that will show up in the numbers. So you would think the best way to do this is by having everybody have a common vision, that same place they're trying to get to. But I think for most people, that's almost not something they can envision. So do you see where you have shared goals with finance? I think this is another poll that we have ready to go, right?
Oh, we asked it in the beginning. So.
Oh, we did. So we have the results already. Very
cool. Yeah. Let me just see if I can bring it up. Can you see it?
Yes, there we go. Okay. So again, this group is way more in tune than most groups I work with. And a lot of times when I ask this question, people are, no, finance and I have nothing in common. And I'm glad to see there's somebody from finance here besides me. So that's very cool. I think, thank you for that input, and thank you for putting that poll back up there because I didn't pick up on that at the beginning. So I think the obvious one, if we start from the bottom on this slide, is the common goal of business growth and success. I think when you work in a company together, everybody wants that business to be successful. But I will tell you, sometimes for the finance organization, it's very hard to see how they actually help that effort. When you're talking to the customers, when you're building the product, when you're providing the service, when you're in the part of the organization that delivers what the company actually does to the customer, it's very obvious what your connection to that process is. When you sit in the corporate office working on spreadsheets, it's sometimes very difficult to understand how you connect into that process and how you can help that process. So looking from the bottom up, the idea that we have performance metrics and analytics is great, but in most organizations, there are dozens and dozens of those, and we measure all kinds of things that may or may not actually help. And part of that is really understanding what drives your business. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more on the next slide, but I don't want to skip over those first two bullets entirely. The first two, data quality and accuracy, I think is something we all strive for. It doesn't matter whether you're in finance or not, whether it's financial data or operational data, you certainly want that to be accurate. If for no other reason, then odds are if you get it wrong, it's going to impact your customers negatively. Compliance and security is another one of those, especially in our world today. Security, especially around data, is highly important. And so if you can see for those first two bullets, I think everybody has a stake in that. And I find that the more friends we make across the business, especially from finance to technology, the easier it is to have all these things happen. But let me get back to that third bullet here. So this idea of performance metrics and analytics. As I pointed out before, finance cranks out an awful lot of information. There's a lot of data that we gather up and spit back out. And a lot of times it comes in the form of financial numbers. It just, you know, whatever the standard financial reports are is what shows up. There are metrics on those for sure. There are ratios, there are margins, there are cost per something, there are revenue per something kind of metrics on there. But without really understanding what's behind those, a lot of times what we measure may or may not actually be useful. I've seen organizations that have elaborate dashboards that measure hundreds of things. And the reality is you can't absorb that much information, and it measures all kinds of things that you either can't influence or that don't provide any value. In one of my experiences, I worked with a director of an IT organization, and he would produce this graph every month about the uptime of the network. So the IT network uptime was like 99.99%. Well, the graph was basically straight across, because whenever it went from 99.992 to 99.994, nobody could tell the difference because the graph just went straight across. It was such a small variation. And so I asked him, I was like, what is the value of that graph? It's like, he's like, well, it's my network uptime. We're proud of that. I'm like, well, you should be proud of that, but do you really have to report that every month if it never changes or never changes materially enough to make a difference? It's like, and by the way, when the network goes down, everybody knows already anyway. So it's not like this chart adds a lot of value, but you produce it every single month. So why don't we focus on something that really adds value? Maybe like, how long does it take you to set up a new laptop for a new colleague? Because there's probably a cost conversation there. Plus there's a customer delight conversation in the context of making it easy for a new colleague to start on their first day. So thinking about metrics and analytics in a different way and engaging with finance to produce those things that could actually help your initiative, help your project, help move the conversation forward, that's where the real value is. So what I propose is that for this third one, this third bullet here, we really start having the conversation around how finance can help the business understand how we get from those key drivers that are the input to what happens in the business through the process in the middle. I mean, things work like there's a machine, there's a process, there's something that happens there, to the metrics, which are the output. You may have heard those referred to as KPIs, like key performance indicators, or just metrics or measures. And then ultimately how those translate into financial results. So let's make an example, a specific example, so you understand what I mean by these terms. Let's say that the driver is the number of salespeople you have. So whatever business you're in, you have somebody selling your service or your product, and those are your salespeople. So the process here is pretty simple. Salesperson, go sell something, whatever that is. In our case, like our salespeople would sell telecommunication services. So let's say the metric we're measuring is how many sales each salesperson generates. Well, now we're having a conversation in the business around, okay, so we have this driver, which is how many salespeople we have, and we have this outcome, which is how much sales we generate per person. And then that translates into a revenue conversation in our financial statements. And here's where finance can start adding a whole bunch of value. And that's basically saying, okay, so our revenue is all these sales that our salespeople generated at the metric level, right? And there are some rules attached. So for example, if a person sells something, we may have counted that as a sale per rep, but if the order never goes through the machinery, never shows up in revenue, we can't count it. If you didn't ship the product, we can't count it. If the customer isn't going to pay us, we can't count it. So now if your results that you're getting out of there aren't what you want, you now have an opportunity to go back over to the left side of the picture and actually change what I show here as levers. The ability to change an input so your driver is different, so your process works differently, so your metrics are different, so your results are different. This is where finance can really add value in helping the business connect the dots. You may ask yourself, well, what levers can I actually change? Well, if you're measuring something meaningful, there are probably a lot. In this example, you could hire more salespeople. You could give them more product to sell. You could give them more customers to target by providing better leads, better lead lists. You could make them more efficient, maybe by putting a system in place that lets them put in orders faster. Or maybe not put in orders at all. Maybe orders go to a different group to input, so they don't have to spend their time doing that. So they can spend their time talking to more customers. Now we're talking about a conversation that's meaningful. Because now what we can say, okay, finance, if I want to hire more salespeople, what is the impact? And we can help with doing, the math on that. You're going to drive this many more sales once they've been here a while, because they have to learn our business first. And it's going to cost you this much. So now we can have a meaningful conversation about what happens. You can figure out what new products cost and how much more revenue they might generate and what the investment needs to be around that. There's a lot of very dynamic, interesting things that can happen when finance stops just reporting in this square on the far right here and really gets engaged in the rest of this conversation with you. But it is a conversation, and the way you tackle this is by communicating. And that's really the Achilles heel of most organizations, because even when we think we communicate, as George Bernard Shaw said, the biggest problem with communication is the illusion that it's taken place, that you said something and the person you're talking to actually heard you, not just heard your words, but actually understood what you said. And that is one of the big gaps with finance. We speak a different language because often we take this position that we don't have to learn the rest of the business. And so when you're trying to do cool, agile, innovative, new things in your business, and you haven't enrolled finance in that conversation, it becomes really difficult to make joint progress and achieve those shared goals because you're not working in unison, you're not working together. So what do? The term invite someone to the table really means is to have a joint conversation. It's about communicating, and it's about authentically communicating. Finance people aren't scary. They really are willing to do this. They just don't know how, so you have to help them. Use your agile coaching skills, use your change management skills, engage in learning from each other. It takes patience, it takes persistence. I find a lot of times challenging people to ask the whys. Why do we do this? Why is it necessary? Why do we have to do it this way if we have to do it? Why can't we do it a different way? So just keeping asking the question for every answer, just ask why one more time, and eventually you run out of reasons to ask why, but it's a good way to start the conversation. Try some things. Sometimes the answer to a problem isn't that somebody's going to figure it all out up front, but lean into some small experiments. We're doing that here at Hargray. My story at TW, it was revolution. It was just stop doing it and do something different. Everybody, right now, we're going to change the world. In this organization, our culture doesn't allow us to do that. We're trying little things. My boss calls it baby steps, little tiny steps forward. We try some stuff. If it doesn't work, we regroup and we try something different. We learn from it. There is no fail. There is only we win or we learn. One of those two outcomes, right? Invite finance to embed. And what I mean by that is bring them along into the conversation. If you're building a new product, for example, invite them to the product planning meeting so they understand and follow back up. Like, did you really understand what happened there? Are there words that we use that didn't make any sense to you because they're jargon, they're an acronym, they're some kind of language that you in finance aren't familiar with? And by the way, while we're talking, help me understand how this is going to show up on my financial results statements. Is this expense? Is this capital? What part of it will show up in revenue? And where in revenue? Is it under product A or under service line B? Help me understand. A finance person that understands what you're trying to accomplish is going to be way more effective at helping you model it, helping you weed out those drivers and those levers you can change if something isn't working the way it's supposed to, and produce results that are actually really meaningful to you. And then focus on that joint business success. You don't have to know everything about every business. John Acuff, in his book Finish, he calls it borrowing somebody else's diploma. You just have to make a friend in that part of the business who can help you with that piece that's not your core skill of expertise. And the more you share that, the more you jointly do that across the business, the more finance can become a business partner and a value add to you instead of being an obstacle in the path of you trying to make progress when you, from an agile perspective, are trying to change the world. So yes, finance can change. And I try to depict this here in the slide of old finance and cool finance, because new finance just didn't sound right to me. Old finance, in many cases, is literally stuck in the 1920s. And I'm not trying to be glib about this, but it was in 1922 that budgeting was invented. It's 100 years old. So is it any wonder that some of the things we do in finance just don't feel like they're right for today's fast-moving, innovative, dynamic business environment? Finance is very used to directing people and telling them what to do. They're not usually good at the collaborating, change-focused, enrolling kind of conversations. As we already talked about, old finance will be very much stuck in rigid budgets. This idea that the world is dynamic, that while planning is of paramount importance, doing it more frequently and really focusing on those key things that matter, focusing on the things that are volatile and that are meaningful, as opposed to focusing on every account in the ledger, it's an absolutely incredible transformation that finance can do if they're willing to engage in that. Old finance is focused on variances against that rigid budget, whereas new finance, cool finance, is focused on results. And your old finance are your traffic light people, whereas your adaptive, your agile finance organization is about the roundabout, the here and the now, the in the present moment, making a decision that makes sense for the business. It takes the business off autopilot, where the only question that gets asked is it in the budget? And really ask the question, is it the right thing to do for the business? And if so, we should make that a priority and focus on that right now. The one last thought I'll leave you with on this topic is don't get stuck on terminology. This idea of a rolling forecast has been a buzzword for the last decade. So any finance person you talk to out there and you ask them about rolling forecasts, they're like, yeah, we do that. Well, the truth be told, the vast majority of people do rolling forecasts wrong, because all they're doing is basically like mini budgets multiple times throughout the year. That's not what a rolling forecast is. Now that agile finance is a buzzword, I guarantee you, people are going to say, yeah, we do agile finance all day long. Don't get hung up on the terminology. This isn't about being agile or lean or Six Sigma or some other fancy buzzword. This is just about being better. This is just about doing things in a way that makes sense in the modern context and that make finance an ally to what you're trying to accomplish instead of being an obstacle. So with that, I thank you. I'm excited to see what popped into the chat because I'm not watching the chat just yet, but I also invite you, if you have questions after this, my contact information is available. So if you'd like to connect, I would welcome that and enjoy it. But Musab, I'll turn it back over to you. I'm sure we have some questions in the chat to look at.
First of all, thank you, Nevine. This has been amazing, to be honest. And we host these kind of events with Agile Jordan. You can check us out on social media and other places, agileJordan.org as well, where you can follow us there and see what we do. I'll stop this now for YouTube.